Let's start our conversation about HTML by understanding how web browsers and web servers work. Let's say you wake up in the morning and you want to log into your favorite newspaper. So you open your favorite browser, which could be any one of these, Internet Explorer or Chrome or Firefox or Opera or whatever, and you type in www.newyorktimes.com. It's a pretty common use case. All of us do this or something like this all the time. Let's deconstruct a little bit what happens next. So let's say I open up a browser window seated at my computer. In the address bar of the browser, I type out the URL of the newspaper that I'd like to visit, and I hit go or enter. What happens next? My computer through the browser is going to communicate with the web server of the New York Times through the cloud. My browser is going to send a request which will travel over the internet, which is represented here as a cloud. That request is going to reach the web server of the New York Times. The New York Times web server is then going to send back a response, and that response is going to be parsed by my browser and converted into a form which I accept. That's the New York Times loading in front of me. What's happening behind the scenes is that my browser is sending a request, and this request basically consists of the browser saying, do you have the information for the URL www.newyorktimes.com? Now the browser is interacting directly with me, and what I expect to see is text with nice formatting, images, maybe videos. That's what the client, and that's what I am, that's what the client is expecting to see. Text, formatting, images, and videos. When the request reaches the web server responds. Effectively, what the web server says is, so you'd like me to hunt up the resources that constitute this information. I'm going to search for it, find it, and send it back to you. And I'm going to do that in the form of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and also the images, videos, and the other resources. Collectively, what the web server sends to the browser includes the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Collectively, these are called the resources. This is an important point, so let's make sure we understand it. The web server is going to send HTML, CSS, and JavaScript along with other resources back to the browser, and the browser is going to render these on the client side. The browser represents the client, the server, the web server is of course the server. In effect, the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript are all going to be rendered on the client side by the browser. They are sent from the server to the browser, and there they are rendered by the browser so that the user, that's me, sees what I expect, the URL of the New York Times. The web servers that we refer to over here are machines which sit somewhere on some data center somewhere. These know how to retrieve the right resources and serve them up to anyone who requests them. It's because that they serve this content up that they are known as servers in the first place. An important website such as the New York Times would have a gigantic data center packed with thousands, maybe even millions of web servers, all of which are just dedicated to retrieving and serving up this HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and associated audio and video. The web browser, which runs on the client's machine, knows how to display this HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and other stuff and render it in a way that makes it clearly understood and aesthetically pleasing to the humans who ultimately are going to be browsing using the browser. So at heart, a browser is nothing but a computer program which knows how to take stuff that is sent by the server and render this stuff, display it so that it is understood by humans. The obvious question then is, how do these browsers know what to display? And the answer is, browsers know exactly how to interpret HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. By interpreting this code, HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, they are able to render whatever was sent by the server so that it is aesthetically pleasing and interesting to the client. For now, let's ignore the role of JavaScript. We'll get to it later in this course, but for now, let's focus on HTML and CSS. The best way to visualize HTML is to think of it as the skeleton of your web page. HTML is what lends firmness, content, and structure to what you see on screen. Again, HTML is best viewed as the skeleton of your web page. It has a structure and content, and this determines to a very large extent what your web page will actually look like once it's been rendered by the browser. But in order for a web page to be aesthetically pleasing for a human being, we need a lot more than just a skeleton. We need skin, and we need some kind of aesthetic rendering of what has been sent by the server. And that's where CSS comes in. CSS is what transforms the skeleton into an aesthetically pleasing rendering. CSS represents the look and feel of a web page. With that by way of preamble, let's plunge in and start creating some HTML pages. This gets us to our first HTML page. Your reaction here might be one of mild intimidation. You might ask, where do I write my HTML? I don't know anything about setting up a web server. Well, for the purposes of learning HTML and CSS, which are client-side technologies, it turns out you can just very easily use your own machine. You don't need to set up a web server, and in fact in this class we are not going to spend a whole lot of time on that topic, which is quite vast and complicated in and of itself. Somewhere on your machine, simply create a file with the .html extension. For instance, I have an Apple Macintosh machine and I just created a directory inside my home directory, and I created a file there called index.html. I then went ahead and opened this file in my browser. And how did I do that? Well, I just typed in the URL corresponding to my file in the address bar of the browser. Remember that browsers can handle URLs which represent just files on your local machine. They need not always refer to URLs on the internet. How do I specify that it's a file on my machine? Well, it's with the prefix that you see over there, the words file, followed by 3 slashes. This is then followed by the path, the directory inside which I have my file. Remember that the paths include forward slashes, and this is something which is true on both Macintosh and Windows machines. A file URL always starts with the word file, a colon, 3 forward slashes, and then the path. And you can browse to this file on your machine and just double click on it. Because it has a .html extension, by default it will open using your default browser. This is a really easy way for us to try out HTML examples, and this is what we are going to use for the duration of this class. And the file that you created with the .html extension, well, this is just a text file, so you can edit it using any editor that you are comfortable with, which could be TextEdit or Emacs or VI or Pico, or if you're on Windows, it could just be Notepad or WordPad. And again, none of these directions change in any way whatsoever if you happen to be doing this on a Windows machine. Specifically, the paths will continue to use the forward slash.